We're not going to have any cold opening this time. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Beth. And we're all you're getting this time.
Yep. So before we get started, I just want to remind our listeners that you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And I am personally on Discord as DM Scorpio number 0660, and I have created a channel for Alien Familiar Media. With just the two of us today, we're going to be talking about the topic of playing characters with mental illnesses.
And first of all, I just want to start out saying this is the most important point of the whole thing. Jesus Christ, people, schizophrenia is not multiple personalities. Schizophrenia has what are known as positive traits, which in this situation just means they're things that are present that wouldn't normally be present. So things like auditory and visual hallucinations and paranoia. And negative traits, which means things which are not present. So potentially problems remembering words, which makes it sound like I have it sometimes. And,
what's the definition of schizophrenia? Or what's this definition of dissociative disorder?
And then dissociative disorder is actually multiple personalities. So there are plenty of books and movies out there that you can find that call schizophrenia multiple personalities, and it's one of my pet peeves. So don't do it, or I will find you.
Yeah, it's one thing that I cannot stand about Stephen King.
Yeah.
It seems like, for some reason, he works it into, like, that sentence, he works it into every goddamn thing that he writes. Calling somebody schizophrenic who has multiple personalities.
Right.
And it works its way into books that I have no idea why the hell it even comes up. It's probably part of his, like, diary of the typewriter, his own...
Hypergraphia, is that what it's called?
Yeah, his own description of hypergraphia, where he just, like, has to just vomit out all of these words onto the page.
And I mean, just, if you're gonna use a term, just Wikipedia it or something, like, make sure that you actually know what it means. So anyway, that's my rant.
Yeah.
I probably have more coming up, considering the topic, but that's the starting rant.
And since it's just going to be the two of us, you're going to hear a lot from the two of us, more than you've ever heard before.
Yeah.
So,
we don't have all the other people around the table to buffer us, so I can just sit here and listen to everyone, which is my preferred method of non-communication.
So as we get started talking about this topic, I want to start off by delineating that I think there's a difference between madness and insanity and mental illness, particularly in games. Madness and insanity is typically very much a plot device, or it is something that is clearly defined within the game mechanics. It usually represents particular tropes and cliches in books and other media. I'm thinking particularly of, like, Call of Cthulhu. Whenever your sanity reaches a certain point, you become temporarily insane, or you become permanently insane, depending on how bad the situation is. And there are certain things that happen in a game and in popular media when a person, quote, goes insane, that really aren't a part of mental illness. Like, they may be parts that actually happen to some people whenever they suffer from certain mental illnesses, but they do not have this huge cluster of symptoms that suddenly onset and then, after the situation is resolved, completely go away.
Completely go away, yeah. And they don't have, like, a lot of times, like, murderousness and being dangerous comes into it in these games. Like in Jordan's Apocalyptia game, if you lose all of your psyche points, then you have to cause some sort of damage to someone else or cause someone else to lose a psyche point in order to basically come out of your little insanity bubble that happens when you hit the end of your psyche.
In that particular instance, those those rules aren't simulating mental illness exactly. They are simulating, in particularly like pretty much every zombie apocalypse movie and TV series you have ever seen, when the situation gets really bad, suddenly a character just does something that is completely stupid and completely fucks over everybody else.
So it's like a temporary psychosis, basically.
Right. And it's emulating that particular trope, and it's really not meant to simulate a real mental illness. Besides just like madness and insanity, mental illness does creep up into games, usually in like the form of drawbacks or flaws or hindrances or whatever negative statistics you have in the game. I mentioned Call of Cthulhu, that's because that's probably one of the biggest names in RPGs that has a significant part of the rules in the rule book that discusses mental illnesses and defines them and talks about kind of how they present. And it comes up in pretty much every other system as some sort of negative trait that you can select for your characters, usually at character creation. And these negative traits are, quote, balanced out so that if you take these negative traits, you can gain positive traits. Like, for instance, in Savage Worlds, you can take a hindrance that is essentially a mental illness. I want to say obsession is a hindrance. I don't have the list right in front of me, but that is something that you can take, and then it gives you extra points that you can then spend on other things, like increase your skill points, increase your attribute points, stuff like that. And it's really a power gamer a way of looking at mental illness, in that if you've got this thing wrong with you, you have to have something positive about your character to kind of balance it out.
Trade off it. And you're also picking the mental illness not because you're wanting to increase the realisticness of your character or to build your character. You're just doing it to get those points, like you said, in a power gamer way, so that you can get those good attributes to balance it out.
And personally, as a game master, I've seen more people take the mental drawbacks and hindrances and stuff like that more often than physical, because
and they don't act them out.
No, exactly.
They don't act them out. And so in a way that it ends up just being free points because they don't role play it. Whereas with a physical attribute, they kind of have to. If you don't have a leg, you're going to have to play that.
Yeah. Not having a leg has a definite in-game mechanical drawback of reducing your character's movement speed to whatever your game reduces it to.
Right.
Oftentimes it's like half. But with mental illnesses, it's a lot more it's more put onto the players to play that out. And a lot of times the players who are selecting these mental traits, I'm hesitant to actually call them mental illnesses, even though by most definitions they would be mental illnesses, but because it's a game statistic, there's a lot more that goes into a mental illness than just a series of quantifiable game statistics.
Right.
So I want to give a solid example of an experience that I had with a character who I had planned on portraying with a mental illness, and then the disaster that ensued. I've mentioned this on the podcast before. It's been several episodes ago. Every time I think about playing a character with mental illness, I think of a game of Vampire the Masquerade that I played more than a dozen years ago. After I get done telling this story, I'm going to pull out several points that we're going to talk about. But in this game, I was bringing in a character as a replacement to my main character because my main character had become unavailable due to plot reasons for an indeterminate amount of time. If anybody is familiar with what torpor is in Vampire the Masquerade, my character got sent into torpor and was basically out of commission for a while. So I have this character. I choose to play a character who is a member of the Malkavian clan. And in Vampire, Malkavians are all affected with some sort of insanity. It's written into the rules. And for my particular character, I had chosen to play a character who had pretty severe paranoia. I have my character all made up. I have the sheet in front of me. I'm all ready to start this campaign. And I show up. We get started. And the storyteller starts off by setting the stage for me. The storyteller tells me that I am in my lair, and then proceeds to describe to me what my lair looks like, essentially describing it as a severe hoarding situation. Then the storyteller tells me what my current visual and auditory hallucinations that my character is experiencing, and I come to find out that these are hallucinations that I'm having all of the time. Okay? Then the storyteller tells me that my character is doing everything in sets of 3. So, before I have ever opened my mouth to say the first words about my character in front of the other players, the storyteller has given my character 3 severe conditions that I did not have before he said them, and before I had even introduced the one that I had selected for my character. So at this point, I basically mentally check out of playing my own character. I went along with it, and because of the way things were being described, I went ahead and I did some zany things just to just to go along with the flow and have a good game where everybody was getting along. But that's something that I've always regretted, having not, one, said something about, like, no, that's not my character. I did not create this character to be this grab bag of mental illnesses.
Yeah. And plus, I don't know, if you had all of that going on, I'm not sure how you'd ever leave the house.
Yeah.
You know?
So, and the other thing I regret is that I went along with it, that I went ahead and I made it a fun and zany thing. I made it a joke. That's always sat uneasy with me. I only played that character for, God, it probably wasn't even a full 2 sessions before me and a couple of other player characters, or me and a couple other players figured out, okay, we're going to bring back my old character, and this is how we're going to do it. On the bright side, that the storyteller went along with that and allowed us to bring my old character back. So I played this character for like 2 sessions, and I personally hated it, but it went along well. We got the sessions to go along well. After I got done playing this character and I was firmly back in my previous character, I found out that this particular storyteller had a previous Malkavian character appear in the campaign before I had joined it. And this Malkavian character was obsessed with stacking waffles.
What?
Yeah. For some reason, this character was the prince of the city, which is the most powerful vampire politically, and oftentimes, like, as far as statistical power, the prince is often the top of the food chain in vampire. And this person spent every night, this Malkavian character spent every night having his servants bring waffles into his chamber and stack them. And it was a catchphrase that this character had, that the thing that he always said was to stack the waffles higher, 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 higher. And
Jesus.
I wish I could explain more about that little bit of what the fuck was going on, but I can't. I still don't understand it to this day, like, kind of what that storyteller was thinking.
Wow.
Clearly, he did not understand mental illness.
Just mental illness equals the zaniest thing you can think of.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. And that's my first point, is that mental illness is not zaniness. It's not fun.
Right.
It's
not fun for you. It's not fun for anybody else.
And if you're wanting to play as a character who has a mental illness, you're doing it because you want to explore something. You either want to explore some aspect of yourself or some like some aspect of somebody you know, you want to gain an understanding. And it's not something that making it fun is not going to understand it.
Right.
It would be, I mean, I hate to make this example, but it'd be on par with like making fun of somebody for like some sort of assault.
Right.
Because it's something that they have no control over. It's something that impacts their daily life in a very negative way. But it's something that's been made the butt of a joke. It's something that's been made fun for other people.
Yeah. It's like laughing and pointing at somebody in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
Like that's, like we see that as obviously ridiculous and horrible. But to make fun of mental illness is just like, nobody seems to care.
Yeah. Fortunately, unfortunately, it was only a dozen years ago. But fortunately, in the past dozen years, there's been a definite shift in public perceptions about mental illnesses. We've still got a long ways to go, but the shift is definitely happening to where it is a more respectful and it is more nuanced in being able to understand what people with mental illnesses go through.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in college, this is kind of off topic, but I'm going to say it anyway. When I was in college, which was in the early 2000s now, because I'm so old, the psychology department actually sold a T-shirt for a while. Did you see that T-shirt?
I forgot about that.
That was talking about, like, it had a bunch of doors on it, like you were going in for your therapy appointment, and each door made fun of a different mental illness. And the only one I can remember is the OCD one said something like knock 3 times in sets of 3. Or something like that.
Yeah.
I think the depression one might have been like knock and then lay on the floor and cry. I mean, they were terrible.
And this was the psychology honors department.
The psychology honors department.
Yes.
Exactly. Clearly nobody on that psychology honors department actually had any sort of mental illness.
Yeah.
I just had to throw that in there because I will remember that for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I had forgotten about it, and I should not have forgotten about it because it is
terrible.
Yes. The other point I wanted to bring out in my story is if your character has a mental illness, it is not their only attribute. In this example, my character was thrown out as having like mental illness was the only thing in his life.
He was defined by it.
Yes. And unfortunately, that was kind of reflected from the rules themselves because it's been a long time since I've looked at the Malkavian clan and in Vampire. Like, the characters who are in that clan, they're like the write-ups about them. But unfortunately, it was a thing in World of Darkness that the Malkavians were insane and that was all there really was to them.
Yeah.
They did weird things. They were monsters and they were terrifying in the way that, like, most people incorrectly believe that mental illness means danger.
Psychosis.
Yeah.
Like, everybody's a psychopath.
Yeah. And not just a psychopath, but somebody who is going to actually go out and harm.
Right.
And that kind of leads into my next point is that contrary to this example that I've given, most people with mental illnesses are very good at hiding it. In the real world, they don't wear this on their sleeves. And as a little bit of proof of this, I've got a nice little statistic from the World Health Organization that about 26%, that they estimate about 26% of the people in the United States have a mental illness. That means that there's more than 1 in 4. So if you personally don't know someone who has a mental illness, guess what? You are surrounded by people who are good at hiding it.
Right.
And even if you do know one person who has a mental illness, or 2 or 3, if you're thinking of people who have mental illnesses, you're not thinking of a quarter of the people I know. I've kind of already gone over the point of like that having a mental illness does not mean you have every mental illness.
Right.
It's not just this random grab bag of symptoms that a person has for no reason. Because that's one thing about a lot of mental illnesses is that there's usually some point in the past that is either the trigger for having a mental illness, like maybe something bad happened to them and they've developed this mental illness as a coping mechanism, as part of a flawed coping mechanism on dealing with something bad, or they've got something like early on in their life that basically foretells that they've got something, that there's some thought process that isn't, quote, normal, that's foreshadowing that there's going to be a problem down the line.
Yeah. And there can also be a genetic component to it too, but a lot of times you don't get understanding from the person that you inherited it from, because of the fact that stigma against mental illness used to be so much worse than it is. Mm-hmm. So you may have a parent, say, who has the same mental illness as you, but they just completely hide it and they completely deny it.
Mm-hmm. And then you get into a very twisting rabbit hole of what came first. Like, did you learn the mental illness behavior by watching the person who was mentally ill, or did you develop it because of the genetic predisposition to these particular symptoms? And it's not, I mean, it's something that psychologists are still studying today to try to parse out, and there's nothing on the horizon that says that they're going to figure it out anytime soon. Having mental illness does not mean you have every mental illness, and people are good at hiding it. It doesn't mean that you're dangerous. Mental illness is not the butt of a joke.
Right.
That's, like I said, that's one of my biggest regrets about that, is that I was participating in it being a joke. Mm. I really wish I could go back and change that, but I can only change going forward.
But you had a situation where you had a GM who was basically forcing you to create a caricature.
Yeah.
Instead of a character. Some things that people don't realize about people with mental illnesses. For instance, they have good and bad days, just like with any physical illness. Somebody who is depressed, I don't know how many times I've run into like, you don't look depressed. I see you smiling all the time. Well, you can smile, you can move your smile muscles anytime you feel like it, you know.
Because it takes fewer muscles to smile than it does to frown.
Oh, God, I hate that. So depressed people can smile and laugh and have good days. And like you were saying, you become very good at hiding the fact that you're depressed. So you do a lot of your crying, or a lot of your just laying around doing nothing whenever you're by yourself, so that other people don't see you. And then, like, anxious people can be surprisingly together in an emergency. Like, I've experienced this myself. Like, I have panic disorder. But whenever there's some real kind of emergency, like I have to call 911 and help somebody, I'm able to just, like, snap into that helping situation. And it's not until later that I feel the anxiety from it.
Which isn't just a nebulous, like, I think I'm like this in this situation. You've actually lived through that situation, and
right.
That is how you reacted.
Right, exactly. I actually have this theory that people with some of the lower level mental illnesses, like depression and anxiety, might actually thrive in apocalyptic scenarios, because their stressors are condensed to, like, the everyday basics. Like, they just have to, they don't have all these things in the world to worry about. They just have to worry about, I need food, I need water, I need to not get killed by zombies. It brings it down to a very base level. It's the same thing I feel like when all the times I've been in the hospital, I'm less stressed sometimes in the hospital than I am at home, because there are so many fewer things that I'm responsible for. Mm-hmm. It just basically brings you down to where you're focused on the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You don't have to worry about self-actualization and all that shit up at the top. You're just focused on what you have to do to survive.
Yeah. And there will be a link in the show notes about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Beth and I graduated from college with degrees in psychology, so we Like, while we just have bachelor's degrees, we don't have advanced degrees, we do have a cursory understanding.
Yeah.
And particularly Beth does a lot of reading about, people's life stories, about, like, getting through, mental illnesses, living with some pretty terrible situations. Beth, do you have any, like, book recommendations? Like, if people wanted to understand a little bit better of what it is like to live with mental illness?
I do actually have several. One of the things you can do, this is the thing I do, is just to try to find forums online where people are discussing books that were very helpful to them in explaining various mental illnesses, and you can find all kinds of recommendations. But some of my favorites, and we'll have these in the show notes too, are Girl Interrupted, which is also a movie, but you should really read the book. It's by Susanna Kaysen, and the main character has borderline personality, but then there's also all the people that she's in the hospital with that have various things, and at least in the book they're portrayed pretty well.
Can I interrupt for just a second, because this is a point that I want to point out. Like, the portrayal of places where people, like mental health centers and stuff like that, in the movies and in TV is usually absolutely awful. Not every mental health hospital and clinic is like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's not like 12 Monkeys, where you've got a big room full of people. Some people are so drugged up that they're just sitting there drooling, unable to do anything. And there's not some wild and zany character who is hopping up on top of tables and, like, just talking really weird and, like, moving their body in really strange tics and stuff like that. Like, basically, Brad Pitt's character in 12 Monkeys. Those types of portrayals are very inaccurate. I've been in mental health clinics. They're not like that.
It depends on the mental health clinic, because there's a huge difference. And I'm going to try, I didn't write this down, but there's a book called Voluntary Madness by Nora Vincent, where I think it's like either 3 or 4 mental health clinics that she gets herself, inpatient clinics that she gets herself into. And there is a wide variety of ways that they are, just like, you know, the difference between the crappy hospital that we have here and the hospital that we drive 4 hours to go to whenever I actually need something important. You know, there's a huge difference in those. Some of the other books I've got for a really good study on schizophrenia and suicide, there's a book called The Quiet Room by Laurie Schiller and Amanda Bennett. For hoarding, there's a book called Stuff by Randy O. Frost and Gail Stikiti. I'm probably butchering that. Absolutely any book by Oliver Sacks. He's one of my favorite people ever. He passed away this past year. I was super sad about that. You can find all kinds. He was just this amazing neuroscientist that wrote all kinds of books about all different kinds of things. You can find pretty much anything in his books. He's actually had a few books made into movies. Awakenings, with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. There's another one, wasn't there? Not that I can think of off the top of my head. And then two of my favorite books, both like touching on like depression and bipolar depression, are The Center Cannot Hold by Eleanor Sachs and An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jamison. If you're going to just, pick 1 or 2 books to read, definitely pick one of those, because those are really amazing for explaining what it's actually like to be depressed. But one of the most important points that I wanted to make is that people, and this goes in with what Clayton was saying, like, people are complex. They're not just a single disorder. They're not just a single personality trait. And it's really important whenever you're creating a character, any character, but especially a character that has a mental illness, is to make sure that that character has an internal logic for what they do. What they're doing can seemingly make no sense to you, but it makes sense to them, or else they wouldn't be doing it. So, for instance, somebody who has schizophrenia, who is paranoid is doing all this stuff like searching for bugs everywhere in their house and, taking different routes, routes that take them way longer to get to their job every day. It doesn't make sense to everybody else, but they're doing it for a very sensible reason in their minds. One example is I watch hoarding TV shows a good bit. I'm really fascinated by that. And there was a woman on one show who had both contamination, cleanliness, OCD, and hoarding, which makes it, and her hoarding was like the dirty kind of hoarding where you have rats and bugs and feces everywhere. How she dealt with it, she had decided that one room, her bedroom, was clean. That room looked the same as any other room in the house, but in her mind, that room was clean and anything that was in it was clean. So she went around the rest of her house with rubber gloves and cleaned everything. She would clean things to what she considered to be, the best point of cleanliness, and then she would put them in that bedroom and not allow anyone else to go in there so they wouldn't become contaminated. So you can have things happen within a person's brain that seem like it's impossible that they could coexist, but there's an internal logic that makes it make sense to that person. And that's one of the reasons why mental illness isn't just zaniness, because what the fuck are the waffles about? You know what I mean? Like, did he watch Stranger Things and he just needs to stack Egos forever? It doesn't make any sense. Let's see.
So your point about having some sort of internal logic, there has to be, this is kind of related to a lot of people who have substance abuse problems also have mental illness.
Right.
Often it's because they're trying to self-medicate, like they're trying to deal with their mental illness with using these drugs that are illegal or not prescribed to them because of the stigma about going to get mental help, or just the fact that a lot of people who have mental health issues end up being poor because of a lot of socioeconomic reasons. People with mental illnesses tend to be in the lower income brackets because it's hard to hold a job when you've got depression and you, one day out of every 10 or 20, you literally can't get out of bed. It makes it really hard to hold down a job. And so people with mental illnesses tend to not have as much wealth, tend to not be able not to have health insurance, tend to not be able to go to the doctor to get the help that they need. Or if you're a teenager, you don't have the tools either mentally to be able to recognize what the problem is, or you don't have the supports at home to be able to say, hey, I need help.
Right. Or somebody's like, oh, of course they're depressed. They're a teenager.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of dismission of the early signs of mental illness. Just like they're just being a teenager.
Yeah.
They're just sad. They're just PMSing.
They're just being surly.
Yeah. Let's see. What was my point?
Substance abuse and
there's usually a reason behind it. It's something that I've seen in games where maybe it's not just mental illness, maybe it's some other thing. Like, sorry, I'm not going to say any names, but I have a player who often plays alcoholic characters, and there's not a pathology behind it. They just drink a lot. Mm-hmm. They've made several characters who just drink a lot. Usually with alcoholism, there's an underlying reason why they became an alcoholic.
Right.
And that's kind of your point of like, there is an internal logic there.
Right.
If a person has alcoholism, they probably got something that they're using the alcohol to medicate.
The next point I wanted to go into a little bit is the idea of loss of access to meds. Like, this could happen, especially in an apocalyptic scenario where you have a character who has a mental illness, they're on some sort of medication, and they lose access to that medication because it's no longer being made, or they're not able to get to a pharmacy where they can find some of it. Don't have your character just immediately lose their mind, because many medicines have really long half-lives, meaning that they are working at least half power. For some, there's one I'm on right now that has a half-life of like 50 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could have a couple, 3 days before they start really feeling the effects of not having their medications. And many symptoms, like you were saying earlier, are also concealable, at least for a while. So until the symptoms really get bad, or there's some sort of trigger for the symptoms, which was something else that I was going to say, is that if you have a character who, like, for instance, I know I've seen just mood swings as a detriment that you can take. I know it was an eclipse phase. You could take mood swings as one of your disadvantages to get extra points, and don't just be, walking around like laughing and then crying like every 5 seconds and making yourself completely ridiculous. Have those mood swings be precipitated by something, like they actually would be in the real world. Like you run into a difficult puzzle and you've spent hours on it and you're not getting anywhere, and so you get more pissed off than the average person would.
Or somebody just walks by you and scowls. Like, that's another thing with, like, I'm sorry, I'm hijacking your point.
Oh,
but like, sometimes the precipitating event isn't something that anyone else would recognize.
Right, exactly.
It can be something that really is innocuous, but it's the perception of the person who is seeing it that they interpret it in a negative way.
That is a common thing with people that have, particularly like borderline personality disorder,
mm-hmm.
different things like that, where they'll interpret things as being really personal that
mm-hmm.
really aren't.
You can just take something in a bad way. Like somebody can say something and you just, that asshole said I was a worthless piece of shit. They really just said that, like, I didn't agree with you.
Or if you've had like enough of a build up of that, like there could be a combat going poorly, and maybe you throw your sword down and leave. I could see something like that happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be. I feel like, and this is kind of a side point, but I feel like if you're going to pick something as a disadvantage and you're going to get those points to use toward something advantageous, you need to really make that disadvantage be a disadvantage at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And not just be, oh, I'm kind of pissy to be around sometimes, but have it so that, you actually create a disadvantage for your group
mm-hmm.
at some points. Like, don't have it be constant, because it wouldn't be with a person in real life,
mm-hmm.
but, have it be an actual disadvantage.
Like the example of, I have the vengeful trait, therefore I am angry all the time. I am pissed off about everything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never in a good mood.
Yeah.
Something that, going back a little bit to where you were talking about the half-lives of medicines, something that I've seen particularly in TV shows and movies, is like particularly pill medicine doesn't take effect 2 seconds after you swallow it.
Uh-huh.
Like, some injections, yes, they do have a very, very fast onset,
mm-hmm.
but it's not something that, like, oh, I'm feeling really anxious. I've got this, my character's got this anxiety disorder. I'm going to take this pill to decrease my anxiety. Well, I'm feeling a lot less anxious now.
Right. It's going to take like half an hour to an hour, most
mm-hmm.
anti-anxiety medications to kick in. If you're talking about an antidepressant, you're talking anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks
mm-hmm.
for it to kick in. So even if your character does come across, a little store of, say, antidepressant medications, and they've had, a break, like they haven't had those medications for a week, they're not going to immediately be back to 100% whenever they start taking those medications. It's going to take a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And again, little details like that can help make these things actual disadvantages and also more real. And I know, some people probably are kind of like, I want to play fantasy. I don't want to deal with all these real life things. But if you do want to have, a more real life experience, these kind of things are important.
Yeah. Not everyone does want to play with these aspects of personality, these aspects of character, but some people do.
Yeah. One of the really important points that I wanted to make, especially from my point of view, is to be careful playing conditions that you have yourself. You have to really kind of know yourself and really kind of do some introspection to see if you feel like you can handle playing a condition that you actually have.
And also know the group.
Know the group. Absolutely know the group. It can on one hand feel empowering to play a condition that you have, like overcoming these difficulties during your quest despite this illness that you have. Or it can feel very exposing. Like, even if nobody around the table knows that you have this, you can feel like, did they know that I'm kind of playing myself right now? And you don't always know if you can trust people with that information. Just kind of a little story. It wasn't too long after I'd been diagnosed with panic disorder and depression, and I was working at a local clothing place, and I had decided, because I was in my last year of college, that I was going to be, I was going to be free with my information, and I was going to combat stigma all by my little self. And so I told the people that I worked with that I had panic disorder and depression. And every single time I had any kind of a bad day at all, like if I didn't smile big enough when somebody waved at me, it was like, are you off your meds today? Did you remember to take your meds this morning? Are you sure you're not off your meds? And that does a number on you.
Yeah.
It really does. And people start seeing everything you do as evidence of your disorder. If you say, I don't feel comfortable helping this man in the lingerie department because he's given me some creeper vibes, then that's because you have panic disorder and you need to get better control over that shit.
And I just want to reiterate, this is not an example you're just making up off the top of your head.
I'm not making this shit up. This is real life, people. And other players also, going back to around the table, like other players' attitudes can bleed into their characters. Like if they have kind of a negative view of people with mental illness, that can bleed into their characters and affect how their character starts treating yours. And then it can start to feel very personal because you're playing a character that has your traits, that even if they know about those traits around the table, then you can start to feel like, man, like this, you don't know if the person has just decided to play a character who feels that way about people with mental illness, or if it's themselves bleeding into that character.
Yeah, we've definitely experienced that, where a person I thought was a very close friend got into a role-playing situation, and suddenly terrible things were coming out of their mouth, and they were saying it was just their character. But they were making comments about things that were very personal, that they were making reference to things that didn't happen in the game. They were making reference to things that were personally happening in our lives.
Yeah. Yep. So that basically leads to, at least for me, my last point. We've looked at how to play a character with a mental illness, and I want to talk about how to play with a character with a mental illness, like how to be another PC sitting around the table with that character. And one important thing is to remember that people with disorders can still be anxious or depressed for quote-unquote normal reasons. Somebody who has depression is not sick because their grandma died and they're sad about it. If a person who has an anxiety disorder is being chased by a bear and their heart rate goes up, that is not because they have panic disorder.
Yeah.
That's all of these, everything's on a spectrum, and every mental illness comes from things that everybody feels, but it's just that instead of being on the normal end of the spectrum, you're on the mental illness end of the spectrum. You're feeling these things in more situations and more strongly than you should, given the situation.
Yeah, it's not, like you were saying, it's not mental illness to be filled with anxiety when you're being attacked. It's not mental illness to be depressed whenever a loved one just passes away. just because you have a character who has one of these mental illnesses doesn't mean that they don't get to react in an appropriate way whenever they're faced with something bad.
Right. I feel like I don't have enough points for that. Can you think of anything else for how to play with a character with mental illness? Or do you think it's kind of been covered by everything else?
A lot of it's been covered, but I just want to reiterate that if you have a player who is playing somebody with a mental illness, be respectful. I mean, it's one of those things that should go without saying, but a lot of things that should go without saying really do need to be said.
Right. Although I guess I did say I just want to touch briefly on playing with a character with a mental illness. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's okay?
I think that's fine.
You think it's good?
I think it's good. You ready to stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Woo!
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.